The candles on Evelyn Marshall's birthday cake flickered in the silence, their warm glow a stark contrast to the emptiness that surrounded her. She sat alone at the grand mahogany dining table, her gaze fixed on the vacant chair across from her. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder with each passing moment, a relentless reminder of time slipping away. Evelyn's weather hands trembled as she reached for the crystal wine glass beside her plate. She took a sip, savoring the rich flavor of her favorite Bordeaux. It was a small indulgence on this, her 82nd birthday, but it did little to ease the ache in her heart. "Another year," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the cavernous dining room. "Another disappointment." The phone remained stubbornly silent. No calls from her children, no hurried apologies for forgotten birthdays. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the ornate mirror on the wall, catching a glimpse of her reflection. The years had etched lines of wisdom on her face, but they couldn't mask the sadness in her eyes. She thought back to birthdays past, when laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet had filled this very room. Daniel, always the serious one, meticulously counting out candles. Rachel, insisting on wearing her princess tiara to every celebration. And Thomas, the baby of the family, gleefully smearing frosting across his chubby cheeks. Where had it all gone wrong? Evelyn's mind wandered to her late husband, George. "Oh, darling," she whispered, "did we fail them? Did our success rob them of something far more precious?" The empire they had built together loomed large in her thoughts. Marshall Enterprises, a testament to their hard work and determination. It had given their children every advantage, opened doors they could never have dreamed of. But at what cost? A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, startling Evelyn from her reverie. She rose slowly, her joints protesting the movement, and made her way to the French doors overlooking the manicured gardens. The roses George had planted for her years ago were in full bloom, their delicate petals a riot of color against the encroaching twilight. "I miss you, my love," Evelyn said softly, pressing her palm against the cool glass. "You always knew how to make things right." As she turned back to the room, her eye caught on a small, frayed notebook tucked away on a bookshelf. Curious, she retrieved it, recognizing it as one of her old journals. She settled into her favorite armchair and began to leaf through the pages, transported back in time by her own neat handwriting. Entry after entry spoke of business triumphs, social engagements, and the constant juggling act of work and family. But between the lines, a pattern emerged. Missed recitals, postponed family dinners, vacations cut short by urgent meetings. Evelyn's chest tightened as she read an entry from nearly 4 decades ago. "Daniel's graduation today. So proud of our boy. Top of his class. Had to duck out early for the merger meeting. He said he understood, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes. Must make it up to him somehow." She flipped forward, finding similar entries for Rachel and Thomas. Each milestone marked, each absence noted with a tinge of regret. The weight of missed opportunities settled heavily on Evelyn's shoulders. "Oh, my darlings," she whispered, closing the journal. "I'm so sorry." In that moment, something shifted within Evelyn. The loneliness that had been her constant companion gave way to a fierce determination. She may have failed her children in the past, but perhaps it wasn't too late to teach them one final, crucial lesson. With renewed energy, Evelyn strode to her desk and picked up the phone. Her fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still nimble, dialed a familiar number. "David, it's Evelyn Marshall. I need you to come over right away. It's time to make some changes to my will." David Mitchell arrived within the hour, his briefcase in hand and a concerned expression on his face. He'd been the Marshall family lawyer for decades, and he knew that a late-night call from Evelyn was no trivial matter. "Evelyn, are you sure about this?" David asked, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the documents spread before them. "Cutting your children out of the will entirely, it's a drastic step." Evelyn's eyes flashed with a determination David hadn't seen in years. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, David. My children have lost their way. They've forgotten what truly matters." She paused, her gaze drifting to a framed photo on her desk. 3 smiling faces looked back at her, frozen in a moment of childhood innocence. I want them to remember the values their father, and I tried to instill in them: kindness, compassion, the importance of human connection. David leaned back in his chair, studying the woman before him. And you think leaving everything to this? Grace Winters will accomplish that. A soft smile played at the corners of Evelyn's mouth as she recalled her encounter with the young waitress. It had been a chance meeting at a small diner, the kind of place Evelyn rarely frequented. But that day, something had drawn her in. You should have seen her, David, Evelyn said, her voice warm with the memory. In all my years, I've never met someone so genuinely kind. She didn't know who I was, didn't care about my status or my wealth. She just saw me as a person. David nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. And your children haven't done that in a long time, have they? Evelyn's smile faltered. No, they haven't. They see the Marshall fortune, the legacy they believe is rightfully theirs. But they've forgotten the woman behind it all. She squared her shoulders, meeting David's gaze with unwavering resolve. This is my last chance to teach them what's truly important in life. Grace will be the catalyst for that lesson. As David began the process of updating the will, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to her children, imagining their reactions when they learned of her decision. Daniel would be furious, no doubt. She could almost hear his voice, cold and businesslike. Mother, this is completely unacceptable. I'll contest it, you know. I won't let some stranger walk away with what's rightfully ours. Rachel's response would be more emotional, tinged with the insecurity that had always plagued her. But Mummy, what will people say? How could you do this to us? Don't you love us anymore? And Thomas, her baby, always so caught up in his own world. He'd probably shrug it off at first, convinced he could charm or manipulate his way back into the inheritance. Come on, Mom. This is just a joke, right? You can't be serious. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of their pain, but she steeled herself against it. This was necessary. It was the only way to break through the walls of entitlement and self-absorption they had built around themselves. Are you absolutely certain about this, Evelyn? David asked one final time as he presented her with the revised will. Once this is signed, there's no going back. Evelyn took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the document. In her mind's eye, she saw Grace's warm smile, heard the genuine interest in her voice as they had talked that day in the diner. She thought of her children, lost in their pursuit of wealth and status, forgetting the simple joys of human connection. I'm certain, David, she said, her voice steady as she signed her name with a flourish. This is my legacy, not the money, not the business empire. This lesson, this is what I want to leave behind. As David gathered his things to leave, Evelyn walked him to the door. The house felt different now, as if the very air had shifted with the weight of her decision. Thank you, David, she said, clasping his hand, for everything. He nodded, a mix of concern and admiration in his eyes. Take care of yourself, Evelyn, and good luck. As the door closed behind him, Evelyn made her way back to the dining room. The candles on her birthday cake had long since burned out, leaving only a faint trail of smoke in the air. She blew out the remaining embers, a sense of peace settling over her. Happy birthday to me, she whispered, a small smile playing at her lips. Exhausted but content, Evelyn climbed the grand staircase to her bedroom. As she prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed different somehow, lighter, unburdened. She slipped between the cool sheets, her mind drifting to the future she had set in motion. Would her children understand? Would they learn the lesson she so desperately wanted to teach them? Only time would tell. As sleep began to claim her, Evelyn's last thoughts were of Grace. She hoped the young woman would use this unexpected gift wisely, that she would continue to spread the kindness that had touched Evelyn's heart. May you all find your way, Evelyn murmured as she drifted off, unaware that these would be her final words. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Evelyn's housekeeper made a grim discovery. The The matriarch of the Marshall family lay peacefully in her bed, having passed away in her sleep. The news spread quickly, setting in motion a chain of events that would soon shake the very foundations of the Marshall family. In a modest apartment across town, Grace Winters hurried to get ready for her shift at the diner, blissfully unaware of the role she was about to play in the unfolding drama. And in their respective corners of the city, Daniel, Rachel, and Thomas Marshall went about their lives, each caught up in their own pursuits, not yet realizing that everything was about to change. The stage was set, the players unknowingly moving into position for a story of inheritance, redemption, and the true meaning of wealth. Evelyn Marshall's final lesson was about to begin, and none of them would ever be the same. The Marshall siblings converged on their mother's estate like vultures circling a carcass. Daniel's sleek sports car screeched to a halt in the circular driveway, followed closely by Rachel's chauffeured limousine. Thomas arrived last, his electric motorcycle humming softly as he parked it beside the ostentatious vehicles of his elder siblings. They gathered in the foyer, a tense silence hanging between them. Daniel straightened his tie, his eyes darting around the familiar surroundings. Rachel fidgeted with her pearl necklace, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the polished stones. Thomas, disheveled and bleary-eyed, ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "Well, shall we get this over with?" Daniel's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. Rachel sniffed, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "I can't believe she's really gone. Our poor mother, all alone in this big house." Thomas rolled his eyes. "Spare us the theatrics, Ratch. We all know you're more interested in what's in the will than mourning Mom. How dare you?" Rachel's eyes flashed with anger. "Just because you couldn't be bothered to call her more than once a year doesn't mean the rest of US didn't care." Daniel stepped between them, his voice low and controlled. "Enough. We're here for the reading of the will, not to air our dirty laundry. Let's try to maintain some semblance of dignity, shall we?" They made their way to the study, where David Mitchell awaited them. The family lawyer looked older than they remembered, the weight of his responsibility etched in the lines of his face. "Daniel, Rachel, Thomas," he greeted them solemnly. "Please have a seat." The siblings arranged themselves around the massive oak desk, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel's mind raced with plans for expanding Marshall Enterprises. Rachel mentally cataloged the family heirlooms she'd always coveted. Thomas fidgeted nervously, acutely aware of the mounting debts that threatened to sink his latest venture. David cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Before we begin, I want to express my condolences. Your mother was a remarkable woman, and her loss is deeply felt." Rachel dabbed at her eyes again. "Thank you, David. Mother always spoke so highly of you." "Yes, yes," Daniel interjected impatiently. "Can we proceed with the reading?" David nodded, unfolding a document with practiced solemnity. "Very well. I'll begin with the last will and testament of Evelyn Marshall." As David read through the standard legal jargon, the siblings leaned forward, their anticipation palpable. Daniel's fingers drummed an impatient rhythm on the armrest of his chair. Rachel's eyes gleamed with barely concealed greed. Thomas chewed his lower lip, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "And now, to the distribution of assets," David continued, his voice steady. "To my children, Daniel, Rachel, and Thomas Marshall." The siblings held their breath, each imagining the windfall that awaited them. "I leave my deepest disappointment and the hope that you will learn the value of true connection and compassion." The room fell silent, save for Rachel's sharp intake of breath. David pressed on, his voice unwavering. "The entirety of my estate, including all properties, financial assets, and business holdings, I hereby bequeath to Grace Winters." The silence shattered. "What?" Daniel roared, leaping to his feet. "This is preposterous. Who the hell is Grace Winters?" Rachel's face contorted in fury. "It must be a mistake. Mother would never dash." "I assure you there's no mistake," David interrupted, his tone firm. Your mother was of sound mind when she made these changes to her will." Thomas, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. When did she do this?" David met his gaze steadily. "The night before she passed away." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Daniel paced the room like a caged animal, his carefully cultivated composure crumbling. Rachel collapsed into her chair, mascara-tinged tears streaking her cheeks. Thomas stared blankly at the floor, his world crashing down around him. This Grace Winters, Daniel spat the name like a curse. She must have manipulated Mother somehow, taken advantage of her in her final hours. "We'll contest this, of course." David shook his head. "I wouldn't advise that, Daniel. Your mother was very clear about her wishes. She left a letter explaining her decision." He produced an envelope from his briefcase, handing it to Daniel. The eldest Marshall snatched it away, tearing it open with trembling hands. As he read, his face paled. "What does it say?" Rachel demanded, her voice shrill. Daniel's eyes scanned the page, his expression a mix of disbelief and growing horror. She says we've lost our way, that we've forgotten what truly matters in life." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Classic Mom, giving us one last lecture from beyond the grave." "There's more," Daniel continued, his voice hollow. "She talks about this Grace person, says she showed her kindness when we couldn't be bothered to remember her birthday." Rachel gasped. "Her birthday? But that was just Ash. The day before she died." Thomas finished, the realization dawning on him. A heavy silence fell over the room as the siblings grappled with the weight of their mother's final judgment. David watched them carefully, seeing the cracks forming in their carefully constructed facades. "So that's it then." Rachel's voice quavered. "Some random waitress gets everything, and we're left with nothing." David cleared his throat. "Not quite nothing. Your mother did leave each of you a small personal item. Mementos, she called them." He produced 3 small, wrapped packages from his briefcase. The siblings accepted them numbly, unwrapping them with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Daniel found himself holding a faded photograph of himself as a child, proudly showing off a report card to his beaming parents. Rachel unwrapped a tarnished tiara, the one she'd insisted on wearing to every family gathering as a little girl. Thomas's package contained an old, dog-eared book of bedtime stories, his mother's elegant handwriting visible on the inside cover. As they stared at these fragments of a happier past, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The anger and shock gave way to a more complex emotion, a mixture of guilt, regret, and dawning self-awareness. "I can't believe she kept these," Rachel whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate curves of the tiara. Thomas clutched the book to his chest, memories of bedtime stories and goodnight kisses flooding back. "We really screwed up, didn't we?" Daniel said nothing, his eyes fixed on the photograph, seeing for the first time the pride and love in his mother's eyes. The moment was shattered by a knock at the door. David rose to answer it, returning moments later with a young woman in tow. She was dressed simply, her waitress uniform partially hidden beneath a worn jacket. Her eyes were wide with uncertainty as she took in the opulent surroundings and the 3 shell-shocked siblings. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly. "I'm Grace Winters. I was told to come here today, but I'm not sure why." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his posture becoming predatory. Rachel straightened, her tear-stained face morphing into a mask of disdain. Thomas leaned forward, his gaze calculating. "So you're the one who's stolen our inheritance." Daniel's voice dripped with venom. Grace took a step back, confusion evident on her face. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." David stepped in, his tone gentle but firm. "Grace, please have a seat. There's something we need to discuss." As Grace sank into a chair, visibly overwhelmed, the Marshall siblings exchanged glances. This was not at all what they had expected. The gold digger they had imagined was nowhere to be seen. Instead, before them sat a young woman who seemed just as shocked by the situation as they were. "Ms. Winters," David began, I'm afraid I have some rather surprising news for you. Evelyn Marshall, the woman you met at the diner a few weeks ago, has passed away." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh no, that's terrible. She was such a kind lady." Daniel scoffed, but Rachel elbowed him sharply. David continued, "In her will, Mrs. Marshall has left her entire estate to you." The color drained from Grace's face. "What? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." "That's what we said," Thomas muttered under his breath. Grace looked around the room, her eyes wide with panic. "I can't accept this. I barely knew her. It should go to her family, to you." She gestured at the siblings. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The Marshall siblings exchanged glances, their earlier certainty about Grace's motives beginning to crumble. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes boring into Grace. "Why did our mother leave everything to you? What did you do to convince her?" Grace shrank back from his intensity. "Nothing. We just talked. She seemed lonely. And I just listened to her." "Listened to her?" Rachel's voice was sharp. "About what?" Grace shrugged helplessly. "About her life, her family. She showed me pictures of you all. She was so proud of your accomplishments, but what?" Thomas pressed. Grace hesitated, then continued softly. She seemed sad, like she missed the way things used to be. The words hit the siblings like a physical blow. They sat in stunned silence, the weight of their neglect settling over them like a shroud. David cleared his throat. "There's more. Mrs. Marshall left a letter for you as well, Grace." He handed her an envelope, which she opened with trembling hands. As she read, tears welled up in her eyes. She says I reminded her of the importance of kindness." Grace's voice quavered. "That our conversation made her feel truly seen for the first time in years." The Marshall siblings exchanged guilty glances, the magnitude of their failure becoming increasingly clear. "She hopes," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that by leaving her estate to me, she can teach her children one final lesson about what truly matters in life." The room fell silent as the impact of Evelyn's words sank in. Daniel's anger deflated, replaced by a dawning sense of shame. Rachel's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the insecure woman beneath. Thomas slumped in his chair, the weight of missed opportunities pressing down on him. Grace looked up from the letter, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can't accept this. It's not right. This should be yours." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and an opportunity. The Marshall siblings found themselves at a crossroads, forced to confront the harsh truths their mother had laid bare. As they grappled with their conflicting emotions, greed warring with guilt, anger with regret, the seeds of change began to take root. Their mother's final lesson was just beginning to unfold, and none of them could have predicted where it would lead. Grace Winters stood at the entrance of the Marshall estate, her hand hovering over the ornate doorbell. The mansion loomed before her, a monument to wealth and privilege that made her feel small and out of place. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation to come. The door swung open, revealing Daniel Marshall's imposing figure. His eyes narrowed as he took in Grace's simple attire and nervous demeanor. "Ms. Winters, how kind of you to grace us with your presence." His voice dripped with sarcasm. Grace straightened her spine, meeting his gaze. "Mr. Marshall, I'm here to discuss the inheritance." Daniel's lip curled. "Of course you are. Come in, then. Let's not air our dirty laundry on the doorstep." He led her through a maze of opulent rooms, each more lavish than the last. Grace's eyes widened as she took in the crystal chandeliers, priceless artwork, and antique furniture. This was a world she could scarcely imagine, let alone belong to. They entered a study where Rachel and Thomas waited. Rachel perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her perfectly manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm. Thomas lounged against a bookshelf, his casual posture belying the tension in his eyes. Well, the woman of the hour, Rachel's voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes were cold. "Come to claim your prize." Grace swallowed hard. "Actually, I wanted to talk about Dash." "Save it," Thomas interrupted, pushing off from the bookshelf. "We know why you're here. The question is, what's your price?" Grace blinked, taken aback. "My price." Daniel circled her like a shark scenting blood. "Come now, Ms. Winters. You can't expect us to believe you're here out of the goodness of your heart. What will it take for you to walk away from our mother's estate?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Grace felt her cheeks flush with indignation. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because I don't feel right about this inheritance. Your mother, Dash." "Our mother," Rachel cut in, her voice sharp, "was clearly not in her right mind when she made that will. You took advantage of her." Grace's hands clenched at her sides. "I did no such thing. I simply showed her kindness when we didn't." Thomas finished, his tone bitter. "Is that what you're implying?" The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. Grace looked from one sibling to another, seeing only hostility and suspicion in their eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. "Look, I understand you're upset, but I'm not your enemy here. I want to find a solution that honors your mother's wishes while also being fair to all of us." Daniel's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Fair? You think it's fair that a stranger walks away with our family's legacy?" Grace felt her resolve strengthening. "Your mother made her choice. Maybe instead of attacking me, you should ask yourselves why she felt the need to make that choice in the first place." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty passed across the siblings' faces, but was quickly replaced by renewed anger. "You have no right to judge us," Rachel hissed, rising from her chair. "You didn't know our mother. You didn't know our family." "And whose fault is that?" Grace shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. "From what your mother told me, you barely knew her either." The room erupted into chaos. Accusations flew, voices raised, and old resentments bubbled to the surface. Grace found herself at the center of a storm of emotion, each sibling vying to prove their devotion to a mother they had neglected in life. As the argument reached a fever pitch, a sharp knock at the door silenced them all. David Mitchell entered, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. "I see you've all had a chance to discuss matters," he said, his tone dry. "Perhaps it's time we approach this situation more productively." He set his briefcase on the desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been going through Evelyn's personal effects, and I found something I think you all need to see." Grace and the Marshall siblings gathered around the desk, curiosity temporarily overriding their animosity. David spread out a collection of letters, journals, and photographs. "These are your mother's private journals," David explained. "She kept detailed accounts of her thoughts and feelings over the years. I think they might shed some light on her decision." As they began to read, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The anger and suspicion gave way to a growing sense of shock and shame. Evelyn's words painted a picture of a woman desperately lonely, yearning for connection with her children. Entry after entry spoke of missed birthdays, canceled dinners, and unreturned phone calls. The pain of her isolation was palpable in every line. "I can't believe she felt this way," Rachel whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Thomas picked up a photograph, his hand trembling slightly. It showed a much younger Evelyn, surrounded by her children at a birthday party. The contrast between the joy in that image and the loneliness described in the journals was stark. "We really screwed up, didn't we?" he murmured. Daniel remained silent, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he read through the entries. Grace felt like an intruder, witnessing a deeply personal moment of family reckoning. She started to back away, but David's voice stopped her. "There's more," he said, producing another envelope. "Evelyn left a final letter addressed to all of you, including you, Grace." With shaking hands, Grace accepted the letter. She unfolded it, aware of the Marshall siblings crowding around her to read over her shoulder. "My dear children," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my final lesson has begun. I know you're angry, confused and hurt by my decision. But I hope that through this experience, you'll come to understand what I've been trying to teach you all these years." The letter went on to explain Evelyn's motivations, her hopes for her children's growth, and her faith in Grace's ability to use the inheritance wisely. As they read, Grace felt a weight settling on her shoulders, the weight of Evelyn's trust and expectations. "She knew," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "She knew exactly how we'd react." Rachel sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "All those years, we thought we were making her proud with our accomplishments, but all she wanted was for us to be there." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. "What do we do now?" All eyes turned to Grace. She stood there, overwhelmed by the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. In that moment, she made a decision. "We honor her wishes," she said firmly, "but not just by following the letter of her will. We need to embrace the spirit of what she wanted for all of us." She turned to David. "Is there a way we can use this inheritance to create something meaningful, something that would make Evelyn proud?" David nodded slowly, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "I believe there is." Evelyn left some suggestions in her papers about charitable foundations she admired. "We could use that as a starting point." For the first time since the whole ordeal began, a spark of hope ignited in the room. The Marshall siblings exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Daniel cleared his throat. I think that's something we could all get behind. A way to make amends and carry on Mom's legacy." Rachel nodded, wiping away her tears. "It's what she would have wanted. A chance for us to learn the lesson she was trying to teach us all along." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand to Grace. "We owe you an apology, Ms. Winters. And thank you for showing us what we'd forgotten." Grace took his hand, feeling the tension in the room dissipate. "I think your mother knew exactly what she was doing. She brought us all together for a reason." As they began to discuss plans for the foundation, Grace felt a sense of purpose settling over her. This wasn't just about money or inheritance anymore. It was about honoring Evelyn's memory and creating something truly meaningful. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still legal hurdles to overcome, relationships to mend, and a foundation to build. But as Grace looked around at the transformed faces of the Marshall siblings, she knew they were on the right track. Evelyn's final lesson was unfolding, teaching them all about the true nature of wealth, family, and legacy. And as they worked together to bring her vision to life, Grace couldn't help but feel that somewhere Evelyn was smiling down on them, proud of the changes she had set in motion. The journey was just beginning, but already the seeds of transformation were taking root. In the end, Evelyn's greatest gift wasn't her fortune. It was the opportunity for growth, redemption, and a chance to redefine what truly mattered in life. As they left the study that day, united in purpose for the first time, Grace caught sight of a portrait of Evelyn hanging in the hallway. The woman in the painting seemed to wink at her, as if sharing a secret only they knew. Grace smiled back, silently promising to carry forward the legacy of kindness and compassion that Evelyn had entrusted to her. The real work was just beginning, but with the Marshall siblings by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did they know, the biggest revelation was yet to come, a twist of fate that would tie their lives together in ways they could never have imagined. But for now, they took their first steps forward, united by a shared purpose and the memory of a woman who had changed all their lives with one final, unexpected act of love. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Daniel Marshall's lawyer presented his final arguments. Grace sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The past few months had been a whirlwind of legal battles, emotional confrontations, and soul-searching. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Ms. Winters exerted undue influence over the late Mrs. Marshall. We ask that the will be invalidated and the estate distributed according to standard inheritance laws. Grace's attorney rose, his voice steady. The defense has presented no concrete evidence of manipulation. Mrs. Marshall was of sound mind when she made her decision. We ask that her wishes be respected. The judge's gavel cracked through the air. I'll review the arguments and deliver my verdict tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." As people filed out of the courtroom, Grace caught sight of Rachel and Thomas huddled in a corner, their faces drawn with worry. Daniel strode past, his jaw set in grim determination. Outside, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions. Grace pushed through the crowd, her mind reeling. This wasn't what Evelyn had wanted. The bitter legal battle had torn the family apart even further, and Grace felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. That night, in the quiet of her small apartment, Grace pored over Evelyn's journals once more. The words blurred before her eyes, but one phrase stood out. "True wealth lies not in what we have, but in what we give." A plan began to form in Grace's mind. It was risky, unconventional, but it felt right. She picked up her phone and dialed David Mitchell's number. "David, I need your help with something." The next morning, as the courtroom filled once more, an air of anticipation hung heavy. The judge entered, her face unreadable. "Before I deliver my verdict, I understand the plaintiff has a statement to make." All eyes turned to Daniel as he stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my lawsuit." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Rachel and Thomas exchanged shocked glances. Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent the past few months fighting for what I thought was rightfully mine, but in doing so, I've lost sight of what truly matters. My mother." He paused, swallowing hard. "My mother wanted us to learn a lesson. It's taken me far too long to understand what that lesson was." He turned to face Grace. "Ms. Winters, I owe you an apology. We all do. You've shown us the kindness and compassion that we'd forgotten, the very qualities our mother valued most." Grace stood, her heart pounding. "Mr. Marshall, Daniel, thank you. But this isn't just about me. Your mother wanted all of us to come together, to create something meaningful." She took a deep breath. "That's why I've decided to decline the inheritance." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "Instead, I propose we use the estate to establish a charitable foundation in Evelyn Marshall's name, a foundation dedicated to fostering kindness, compassion, and human connection, the values your mother held dear." She turned to face the Marshall siblings. "But I can't do this alone. I'm asking you, all of you, to join me in carrying forward your mother's legacy." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Rachel stood, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm in." Thomas followed suit. "Count me in too." All eyes turned to Daniel. He stood slowly, a mix of emotions playing across his face. I think Mom would have liked that." The judge smiled, an unusual sight in her courtroom. "Well, it seems we have a resolution. I'll have my clerk draw up the necessary paperwork. Court is adjourned." As they left the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements. But for once, the Marshalls and Grace moved as a united front, pushing through the crowd together. In the weeks that followed, they threw themselves into establishing the Evelyn Marshall Foundation. The mansion was converted into the foundation's headquarters, its opulent rooms now filled with the buzz of purposeful activity. Daniel's business acumen proved invaluable in setting up the organizational structure. Rachel's social connections brought in high-profile donors and supporters. Thomas's tech expertise streamlined their operations and outreach. And Grace, she became the heart of the foundation, her innate kindness and empathy guiding their mission. One evening, as they gathered in what was once Evelyn's study, David Mitchell arrived with a stack of papers. "I found these while going through the last of Evelyn's personal effects," he explained, spreading the documents on the desk. "I think you'll find them interesting." As they leaned in to examine the papers, a photograph slipped out. Grace picked it up, her eyes widening in recognition. That's me," she whispered, staring at the image of a young girl in a school uniform. Daniel peered over her shoulder. "Are you sure? This looks like it was taken years ago." Grace nodded, her hands trembling. "It was my first day at St. Mary's Academy. But how? David cleared his throat. According to these records, Evelyn anonymously sponsored a scholarship program at St. Mary's for underprivileged children. It seems, Grace, that you were one of the recipients. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice filled with awe. Mom knew. She knew all along who you were. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. She didn't just pick a random stranger. She chose someone whose life she had already touched. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. All these years, she was teaching us about kindness and generosity, and we were too blind to see it. Grace sank into a chair, overwhelmed. I never knew. That scholarship, it changed my life. It's the reason I was able to get an education, to have opportunities one never dreamed of. She looked up at the Marshalls, tears in her eyes. Your mother's kindness came full circle. And now, with this foundation, we have the chance to create countless more circles of kindness. As the reality of their connection settled over them, a sense of purpose and unity filled the room. They weren't just honoring Evelyn's memory. They were living out her values, continuing the legacy of compassion she had begun years ago. In the months that followed, the Evelyn Marshall Foundation flourished. They funded scholarships, supported community programs, and launched initiatives to promote empathy and human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. Daniel, once driven solely by profit, found a new sense of fulfillment in using his business skills for the greater good. Rachel's social calendar became filled with charity events and volunteer work, her need for status replaced by a genuine desire to make a difference. Thomas's innovative spirit found new purpose in developing technologies to support their outreach efforts. And Grace, she blossomed in her role, her natural kindness amplified by the resources now at her disposal. The shy waitress who had once served Evelyn coffee now stood confidently before crowds, inspiring others to embrace compassion and generosity. On the first anniversary of the Foundation's launch, they gathered once more in Evelyn's study. A portrait of her watched over them, her eyes seeming to twinkle with approval. Daniel raised a glass to Mom, whose final lesson turned out to be her greatest gift. Rachel smiled, adding, to the power of kindness and the connections it creates. Thomas nodded, to second chances and new beginnings. Grace looked around at the faces that had become like family to her. To Evelyn, whose small act of kindness all those years ago set in motion a legacy none of us could have imagined. As their glasses clinked together, a sense of rightness settled over them. They had each been transformed by Evelyn's final bequest, not of money, but of purpose and understanding. Outside, the sun set on another day of the Foundation's work. In homes across the city, lives were being changed by scholarships granted, support offered, and kindness shared. The ripples of Evelyn's legacy spread outward, touching lives far beyond the reach of her immediate family. And in that moment, as the Marshall siblings and Grace stood united in purpose, the true meaning of Evelyn's parting gift became clear. It wasn't about the money or the estate. It was about the connections forged, the lessons learned, and the lives touched. In the end, Evelyn Marshall's greatest legacy wasn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the kindness and compassion she inspired in others. And as the Foundation continued its work, that legacy grew, a testament to the enduring power of one woman's love and the unexpected ways it could change the world. The story of the Marshalls and Grace Winters would be told for years to come, a tale of redemption, of second chances, and of the transformative power of kindness. But more than that, it would serve as a reminder to all who heard it that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can grow into the most profound legacies. As night fell and the city lights twinkled below, the warmth of Evelyn's presence seemed to fill the room. In that moment, they all understood the truth of her final, unspoken lesson, that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. And so, with renewed purpose and open hearts, they stepped forward into a future bright with possibility, carrying Evelyn's torch of kindness and compassion into a world that needed it more than ever.